Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar, Driving and Multiple Sclerosis. We're very happy that you could join us this evening. My name is Brian Thompson. I'm a programs manager for CanDo Multiple Sclerosis. For those of you that are new to CanDo MS, we provide educational programs to families living with MS to help them thrive. So you can visit our website, which is cando-ms.org, to learn about our in-person and online programs. But we have seven big objectives. We're going to start by talking about the role of driving in our lives and in our society, and how changing abilities can affect us. We're going to talk about the different skills needed for safe driving and how MS and questions is through the online program at GoToWebinar. So this evening, we're going to be talking about the subject of driving and how MS can affect that. So we're going to cover a lot of information this evening, but we have seven big objectives. We're going to start by talking about the role of driving in our lives and in our society, and how changing abilities can affect us. We're going to talk about the different skills needed for safe driving and how MS and MS symptoms can affect those skills. We'll talk about identifying the signs of altered ability and how to evaluate your driving skills, specifically through a certified driver rehab specialist, and what kind of recommendations and adaptations they can recommend. We'll go over a lot of different cool equipment that is now becoming available. And then we'll discuss how the changing abilities can affect relationships and family dynamics, and the importance of communication with this sensitive topic. And then finally, we'll talk about exploring ways to cope if it is time to hang up those keys. We'll talk about ways of coping with that, and finding other ways to stay active, including alternative transportation. First, we have Ali Azeen. Ali is an occupational therapist at Dominguez Hills. He graduated in 2012 with a Master's of Science in Occupational Therapy. He's a certified driver rehabilitation specialist, evaluating individuals for fitness to drive and recommending adaptive equipment to maintain independence. He was the coordinator of the driving rehabilitation program for Scripps Memorial Hospital from 2012 through 2018. And he recently opened his own private practice, driver rehab specialist, serving residents of San Diego. He is also a contributing faculty at the University of St. Augustine for Health Sciences. And we also have Cecilia Simon. Cecilia is a feature writer and editor specializing in long-form journalism with expertise in education, psychology, health, and media. In addition to writing for several newspapers, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, Cecilia has been a frequent contributor to Psychology Today's magazine and online blog. Cecilia is also an adjunct professor at America University's School of Communication and completed advanced studies in developmental psychology. So it's my honor to introduce Ali and Cecilia.
Hi.
Hello, everyone.
So this is Cecilia speaking, and I'm going to be starting off the webinar talking a little bit about the psychological impact of driving and having driving be taken away from us. But I think that it's best to start with talking about what driving tends to mean to us. So driving seems to frequently be associated with a sense of freedom, and we've picked this idea up through many means, not the least of which is our popular culture. We also probably have this sense of what driving has meant to us as individuals. When you think of your first experience of driving, the exhilaration of being behind the wheel and taking off onto the open road after passing your driver's test, for example, what taste of what it feels like to be an adult and independent. So next slide, please. Hello. Okay. So from the signs from everyday life, from the times we were children. Next slide, please. We've picked up these signals about what driving means. These are deeply rooted, maybe back into our infancy in some ways. I don't know about many of you, but I remember driving my children around in the car, hoping to quiet them down if they were crying, and calming myself down. And it usually worked, at least for me. So we have many, many associations with driving. Driving tends to feel glamorous. It confers on us this sense of independence, taking on the open road with many possibilities and metaphors and adventure. It gives us a sense of autonomy. We can get in the car whenever we'd like, do what we want, when we want to do it. You need a certain amount of strength to drive. You need to be physically capable. Your reflexes need to be sharp. Driving is a difficult task, and cars are complex machines. Driving also gives us a sense of being mature, being good citizens, exercising good judgment, hence our exhilaration once we're, in that car for the first time as a 16-year-old or whatever the driving age is in your state and getting off on that open road. You also have to be mentally quick, and you need to be able to make quick judgments on the road for safe navigation. So generally makes you feel very good about yourself. So it's really no wonder that most people don't want to give up driving. On top of all that, as we all know, that driving is very practical, and the way our culture is set up and our society is set up and our communities are set up, our lifestyles are built on a dependency on cars and our ability to drive ourselves. We drive to work. We drive to go shopping whenever we'd like. We bring ourselves to doctor's appointments. We transport our kids to school events, social events. We socialize ourselves a lot based on our ability to drive ourselves. So for many of us, driving also feels like survival. And I think that one of the myths that we have to puncture tonight is the sense that it doesn't necessarily have to be associated with survival. There are very many ways around being the person in the car doing the driving and getting on with one's life in a meaningful way. Ali, I'm going to give this over to you. Driving is dangerous and complex, and Ali can talk about some of those aspects of being in a vehicle.
So I'm going to begin with some cold, hard facts. Motor vehicle crashes are a leading cause of death in the U.S. In 2011, motor vehicle crashes killed more than 32,000 people and injured more than 2.6 million. And that's from the CDC. When we're looking at driving, there's a lot of components to it that we don't think of. There's the vision, the cognition, and motor functions are key to safe driving. And the risk of driving increases when there are deficits in any of these areas. So, for example, in the picture on the bottom, it's definitely exaggerated with a person with a phone, hamburger, and drink in their hand. But when a person is not paying attention to the road because their hands are holding on to something else, their vision's away from looking ahead, and their thinking and mind is even not paying attention to the driving factor, and a miss that on the bicycle in front of them. So when I'm talking about physical and motor components, what I mean is the coordination, the range of motion, strength, sitting balance, all those come into play. We use these to access primary controls. So primary controls in driving are steering, braking, and accelerating. Those are the main things. For secondary controls, those are the turning the signals, using the wipers, headlights that we also need as we drive to be safe. And we need quick reaction times to avoid hazards. We have to be able to steer away from a hazard on the road or brake if a child runs into the road chasing their ball. When we're talking about visual perception components, I'm talking about scanning. So looking at the environment, looking at the bicyclist next to you, looking at the stoplight ahead, making sure it's been a stale green and now it's going to change into an orange or a red. Depth perception, visual fields, contrast sensitivity. Contrast sensitivity, for those who don't know, is, for an example, imagine an island in the road. A different shade of gray than the road itself. You pick up on that contrast. Someone with poor contrast sensitivity is going to go over that and cause some serious damage to their undercarriage. This comes into play a lot during nighttime because we have less light, and seeing an outline of a dark car, we need good contrast sensitivity to see that. In addition, visual acuity and visual perception are important. So these are some examples of ways vision comes into play. So again, scanning at the intersection, I can cross traffic, using depth perception to decide when to make a turn or when to stop. Having intact visual fields, so you identify all potential hazards in your looking out your window. Visual acuity to read important roadway signs or street signs. Contrast sensitivity I mentioned, and then visual perception. One of the ways you look at that is maintaining lane alignment. The final factor with driving is the cognitive factor, and that's usually it's the most important one, of course, and it's the hardest to remediate. That's when we're looking at attention, processing speed, memory, decision-making, planning, organization, multitasking, all these executive functioning skills. So determining when it's safe to change lanes. Do you have enough room to make that change, or is that car coming too quickly from behind? Knowing when to yield to oncoming traffic. When in a roundabout, when it's safe for you to yield or advance into the traffic circle. Deciding when to get over on the freeway for an exit. So ideally, hopefully, most drivers out there, most of you listening, when your exit's coming up, you're going to get over within a mile or two. You're not going to wait when it's half a mile away or a quarter to start changing lanes all the way over. Again, anticipating hazards, seeing that, hey, maybe the car in front's going slow, and what's going on? Why is that happening? Is there something on the road, and noticing to reduce your speed, noticing traffic signs and obeying them, and then, of course, remembering directions to where you're going. A common issue is if you forget where you're going, you're going to start looking around for things that are familiar, and when you start looking around, your eyes go off the road, and that's when an accident can happen. So this picture shows an example of how physical impairment can affect a driver. So poor reaction times, so not being able to lift your foot from the gas to brake to stop in time to avoid this pedestrian, or even maybe poor coordination. Maybe your foot getting stuck or missing the pedal completely could lead to this driver having difficulty in avoiding swerving this pedestrian. With visual impairments, you can see with a car in front where it's straddling the lane marker, and poor visual perceptual skills may cause that. Perceiving lane markings. So in this picture, there's a lot of information that we kind of take for granted when we're looking at what it constitutes as visual skills needed. So to begin with, the first thing you should see is that red light there. Then we're going to see the pedestrians. Then we're going to see the car in the middle of the intersection, or the right marking on the road. Behind the car, above it, the do not enter, and on the left, no U-turn and no left turn. So all these things a person has to take into information so they don't end up in an accident or injure themselves or another. With cognitive impairments, a person can have decreased sight or risk. So if a person has overconfidence, thinking there's nothing wrong with them, when there's obviously some issues, that always worries me, because if a person recognizes it and then they're able to make adjustments to it. Another cognitive impairment, poor planning and organization. So kind of what I was saying with, on a freeway and waiting till the last moment to exit. Your processing speed. So processing speed is how quickly you take information in and respond to it. So, and that's with that, if you're not able to see the hazard on the road, that's already a delay. And by the time you react to it, and if there's a delay motorally, that doubles the issue with reacting in time. Impaired, sustained, or divided attention. So with divided attention, it's looking at not just where you're going on the road, but keeping your attention to maybe the car next to you with its signal on. They're going to try to merge into your lane. Poor memory, impaired topography, which is knowing your location, which, granted, some people are just have that as an issue, but these are some issues when we're looking at cognition and how it could relate to driving impairments. So finally, here's a little chart of the different ways abnormal visual, perceptual, and attention, how it can impact driving. So again, may not perceive, attend, or interpret a stimulus, so not seeing a median ahead or a sign saying to reduce the speed because of a curve up ahead. Executive dysfunction, not being able to execute an immediate response or correction. So, for example, I've seen when there's construction work and a lane is shut down, and when I'm with a person who has this issue, they kind of freeze on what to do. Their normal path is changed now, and they can't think of how to respond to this new stimulus. Abnormal memory, forgetting how to react to specific driving scenarios. So when it's raining, reducing our speed or turning our lights on, or forgetting where directions are to a favorite grocery store or hair salon. And then the motor dysfunction, I'm looking at if it's difficult to control or steer or apply the brakes or move a foot off an accelerator. And then Cecilia can tell us a little bit more about how MS specifically can affect driving.
So yeah, cognitive and physical acuity they're essential to safe driving, and studies show that cognitive changes, physical changes like spasticity affect driving performance and can increase your chance of getting into a car accident. And in fact, some studies have shown that this is the case, that persons with MS, according to one study, are 3 times more likely to have a car accident. And this not only puts themselves at risk, but others on the road as well. And then from just a purely kind of selfish point of view too, a car accident can exacerbate MS symptoms and adversely affect its progression. So it's another thing to think about when you are getting into a car and not feeling completely confident. And also, it's really important too to remember that your well-being has a direct impact on the lives of family and friends. And all of this, again, we keep coming back to the idea of what independence means to us and how cars kind of confer that sense of independence. But independence also means being safe and keeping yourself safe so that you can live the life that you want. So one way to start to achieve this sense of independence and also trying to evaluate where you are in the driving spectrum and whether or not you should start to modify, cut back on your driving, is to start to pay attention to certain things. So we all have that inner voice and instincts that we know are there, but that we don't always pay attention to. But if you think you're feeling uncomfortable or that perhaps your confidence is lagging behind the wheel, it's probably the case. Our bodies and our minds are very good at sending signals to let us know that something's not right and that we should pay attention to it. Sometimes the last thing we want to hear is the opinion of others because maybe we fear what they're going to say or whether they're going to confirm some of our own fears. But it's probably worth thinking about whether or not family, friends, or doctors have expressed concern for you in ways about your safety behind the wheel. Have they suggested that maybe you start to modify your vehicle, and have they even expressed an unwillingness to be in the car with you? These are big things to take note of. And then we have the car itself. We all get dings and little dents, but are you noticing an increase in those dings and dents in your car? Should that be telling you something? Have you been in any small accidents? Have you been pulled over by the police more frequently? Have you received moving violations? Taken in whole, when just paying attention to these pieces that may add up to a bigger picture are important in terms of gathering the sense of self-awareness and where you are on the spectrum. So Part of this is all of our tendencies, I think, to want to deny things that we may not want to hear or live through. So part of the evaluation is getting a sense of what driving means to you and what it means in your life. What are the practical reasons that you love to drive or that you have to drive? What emotional attachment do you have to the act of driving? Do you associate a sense of pride with your ability to drive or sense of freedom? So I think if you can parse out these types of meanings, that you may start to come to terms with your sense of independence and how that relates to being on the road and being able to conduct your life in your vehicle. And I think that can open up ways for you to start to have a discussion about how or when really to make adaptations to your car, to maybe modify your changing habits, and then at some point perhaps having to give it up altogether. But the dialogue needs to start, and that has to come from being able to self-evaluate. Sometimes the self-evaluation can come by just recognizing some of, thoughts or reactions that you have that could be red flags that it's maybe time to adjust. So I just wrote some of these down, maybe some common thoughts that people who are uncomfortable driving may have. But if you're asking yourself if you're only feeling comfortable driving during the day or at certain times during the day, that might indicate that, you need to modify. I often feel too tired to drive, but I'm doing it anyway because we have a list of reasons that we can get around that one. I have to get to work. I have to pick up my kids. I need to go grocery shopping. I'm the only one who can get myself to a doctor's appointment. You can examine whether or not these thoughts are actually true. Sometimes I feel unsafe behind the wheel. I mean, if you're having that feeling, that's a real red flag. Again, with the dings in the car and paying attention to that, more physical aspects of the vehicle itself. I'm not comfortable driving my grandchildren or my children. Is that a fleeting thought? I have trouble concentrating when the radio is on in my car or when I have a passenger speaking in there. And I fear discussing my uneasiness with family or with my doctor because, well, perhaps they're going to make me stop driving if I bring it up. Or maybe they're going to make me feel like I'm sick or inadequate as a person. And many of us don't want to burden our family and friends with having to drive us or having to help us get through the day. So these are all kind of thoughts and red flags that may signal to you that it's time to modify. Then there's the physical changes, and this checklist is pretty simple to go through and to ask yourself about, are you feeling fatigued? Do you have other physical symptoms like leg tremors, muscle weakness or stiffness, spasms, cramps, pain, particularly in arms or your feet, which are really critical for driving? Do you have difficulty getting in and out of the car? You're having difficulty filling your car up at a gas station? Can you move your foot between the gas and the brake pedals easily? Are you feeling a sense of loss of sensation, strength, or coordination that could impact how you operate your vehicle? Your reaction times, good to monitor. Visual problems is a big one. Blind spots, compromised peripheral vision, blurred vision. Can you distinguish the colors of stoplight? And again, driving at night or thinking that you need to cut back on driving at night is another indication that your physical changes you need to pay attention to. And then there's the cognitive or emotional problems that can interfere. Ali went through some of these, but some other things to think about are things like, are you able to judge your distance or your rate of speed? Are you feeling anxious or fearful around driving? Memory problems. Have you forgotten your destination? Are you getting lost more frequently? Are you able to concentrate on the task at hand with driving? Driving decisions while you're in the vehicle, really important to be able to act and react quickly. Are you experiencing mood changes like anger or depression? that could interfere with operating the car. Individuals who have MS are more prone to experience depression, anxiety, anger, and insomnia. The National MS Society has a study, reports a study that suggests that clinical depression is more frequent. They report about 50% of people with MS experience major depression, 65% experience cognitive impairments. These types of things could interfere with your ability to drive in a way that's going to keep you safe. So relationships and the role of family and friends, talked a little bit about this already, but really important because this is your support system. And we discussed some of the reasons why you could be hiding your concerns about your health and its impact. But none of us, want to burden others with our own problems, but perhaps you're fearing that you're going to burden them with your illness, or that you have to depend on family or friends for transportation, or with them finding you alternatives to transportation. The fear that you may appear sick in their eyes, that perhaps you're going to have your car taken away at the first mention of having some self-doubt, and the fear of starting an argument and interfering with your relationships with people who you love and who are concerned about you. So many of us like to think, and this goes back to the denial aspect of our discussion, but perhaps you think that no one's noticed. So I would urge you to put yourself in your loved one's position and ask whether or not you would notice things about them. So they've noticed. They notice that you, they notice your good days, they notice your bad days, they notice if you're having issues and problems with driving. They may not be talking with you about it for various reasons. Perhaps they tried and you rejected their intervention. Maybe they fear your reaction. They want to avoid arguments, fights, anything that's going to make you not feel good about yourself. In the interest of family and personal harmony, family members tend to back off. And perhaps they're also investigating other ways to get you to stop driving. The DMV, they could be going directly to the DMV and reporting you as an unsafe driver so that a third party can just intervene and gets them off the hook. DMVs typically require that a person who's reported has to go in to take a driver's test. They may also be intervening by way of your doctor and having your doctor ask you those questions and perhaps get you to make modifications. I think the worst thing that can happen is to have your license taken away in an abrupt and humiliating manner just by a third party. So it's kind of better to have a discussion going. I'm recalling my aging mother who had vision problems, going into a vision facility innocently looking for glasses that would help her with her reading and magnifying print. And instead, they took her to the back of the office, and they immediately took her license away from her coldly. And it was a hurtful and humiliating experience for her. And as a family, we had tried gently to get her to stop driving or to cut back in certain ways. And unfortunately, it happened by an uncaring third party. So I think you want to avoid that kind of scenario for yourself and have the people who love you help you out to make the best decisions. That includes your physician. Your doctor is your best advocate. They understand MS, and they are certainly sympathetic to the challenges around driving with MS. And in a very practical way, perhaps some of the issues that you may be starting to experience have to do with medications, and perhaps your doctor can adjust the dosages. That can help you improve concentration, coordination, reaction time. A doctor can also be a very objective voice of authority, and speaking not only to you, but also to family members on the modifications that can keep you driving as long as possible. So a doctor's intervention isn't necessarily to get you to stop driving or to shorten your time on the road, but to make it so that you are able to continue with driving and living a productive life in your vehicle as long as it's safely possible. Doctor can order tests like eye exams, get precise information, and share that with you, share that with your loved ones, put your minds at ease, or make adjustments as necessary based on what the tests come back as. A doctor can also direct you to a driver rehabilitation specialist who can provide evaluations, risk modifications, adaptive equipment, much as Ali does. And so I'm going to turn this over to him where he can explain a little bit about what those evaluations consist of.
So just like Cecilia shared about her experience with her mother and that third-party vision professional just taking the license away, with the driving evaluation, usually I get recommendations or referrals from a physician who really isn't sure. They don't want to be the bad person and totally take the license away, but they're also concerned about the person and their safety and the community safety. So a driving evaluation by a certified driver rehab specialist, typically done by occupational therapists, involves three factors. There's a clinical evaluation, the on-the-road evaluation, and if equipment's needed, adaptive driving training sessions. So what would you expect in a clinical evaluation? If you go see a CDRS, it should be about an hour and a half to 3 hours in length. That part of it is where I get information about your MS diagnosis, how long you've had it, what type you have now, is it remitting or relapsing, what medications you take, any other medical history that's significant, your driving history, knowing your day-to-day routines. Are you working still? Retired? All those important factors, because the clinical evaluation really looks at a driver globally. So doing poorly in just one aspect doesn't mean you can't drive. It's taking all that information in. In addition to the profile with the physical, visual, cognitive components, and then some facilities, the practices, have a driving simulator that we can see how a person does with hazards that we can replicate out on the road. So the physical components in the clinical evaluation, again, looking at the range of motion, so that's the flexibility of the neck, looking, scanning intersections, checking blind spots, looking at the trunk. So sometimes with an individual with an MS, if they have poor sitting balance or trunk control, a recommendation could be for torso strap to be used in the driver's seat, because when we're making turns and those centrifugal forces make us sway one way and someone has poor trunk support, that can make them lean to one side significantly and affect their driving. In addition to looking at their coordination and strength in their arms and legs, and looking at their sensation testing and brake reactions. So that's a picture of a brake reaction measure that's used commonly in a lot of different practices by CDRSs. When we're looking at visual components, we want to make sure that the acuity, peripheral field, visual field, pursuits, which is tracking an object, saccades is looking and scanning, depth perception again, judging distances, color perception, the MVPT, which is commonly used in research, has backed it with driving performance, is called the motor free visual perception test. And then the UFOV, the useful field of vision. These are all typical assessments you would expect to see in a clinical evaluation. The driving simulator, like I explained earlier, evaluates basic driving skills, seeing if a person can match the video to the screen, seeing if how they're steering and braking and signaling, all those, it's tracking and recording. Now, it's still not the, as we say it in the business, the gold star. The gold star is actually taking a person out on the road, but it gives an idea, combined with all the other testing, of whether someone warrants an on-the-road test, or based on the performance, it's too dangerous to continue. If we go out on the road, it's typically done in the evaluator's car because it has brake pedals on the passenger side for safety and sometimes gas pedals. Typically, they should allow you to get familiar with the car in a parking lot so you get used to the steering and the gas and brake, and slowly advance the difficulty of the driving environment. So starting off in residential areas, and then business areas, and then high-speed freeway areas if needed. Recommendations, there's typically 4 recommendations. Either you're fit to drive, just continue, and maybe be reevaluated in a year or 2, because MS is progressive. Fit to drive with restrictions, so freeway driving or nighttime driving based on scores and measurements from the clinical evaluation. So, for example, if someone has poor contrast sensitivity and depth perception and brake reaction, that would make them a hazard to drive at night and on freeways. Or, with a lot of the clients I've seen with MS, requiring adaptive equipment, so their coordination for the brake reaction was poor. They were getting their feet stuck on the pedal. It was too slow. Cognitively, they were doing fine. Visually, they're doing fine. So we could do some adaptive equipment modifications and training. And we'll get into that a little bit later. For other drivers, sometimes continuing or starting outpatient services, maybe outpatient PT, OT, or speech to work on some deficits seen in the clinic evaluation. And for some individuals, if it's just bad habits, if they've been driving for 30 years and they've just consistently rolling through stop signs and not using their signals, that's when a driving school that could help with that would be recommended. And finally, some individuals, driving cessation or retirement. You know, the deficits are too great and it's not safe for them to drive with any restrictions or any equipment, and providing alternative transportation options, whether it's through community centers, senior centers, learning how to use the rideshare programs these days, that. Cecilia, can you talk about how we can modify risk specifically when the challenges of MS?
Sure. I think I need the next slide. Is this? So, yeah, this one is my slide. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm going to explain some of the points about modifying the risk on the road. So eventually adaptations are going to become essential, but they should be instituted as necessary. You can start with something as simple as just observing your daily rhythms to find out what kinds of adaptations you might need, or if you need them at all. So, for example, if your symptoms are more pronounced later in the day, you might want to simply modify by driving only in the morning. Don't drive when you're having a bad day. Minimizes your risk on the road. Drive when you're feeling high energy. Avoid bad weather, high traffic, distractions. You can also create a radius within your home, neighborhood, familiar, or within your work environment. You want to avoid driving when you have another illness. Typically, MS symptoms can worsen when you're sick with something else, so it might be a time to stay out of your car. If you're sensitive to the heat, causes fatigue, you can avoid driving during warmer times. Also, you might want to avoid driving during MS exacerbations and then pick it up again when that ends. And then taking a look at public transportation options before you think you need them can be really very useful. They will supplement your driving routine and you'll have them at the ready. And then, again, communicating your MS symptoms to your loved ones is a way to start talking adaptations, or at least moving into that direction of keeping the lines of communication open. So it's important, again, to remember that just because you have MS, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be driving. And that's got to be kind of the bottom line with starting the discussions. You're going to fight these stereotypes from yourself and from others. If you're the one to start the discussion, it will relieve stress on your family and your friends who care about you and may be afraid to bring it up, but who nevertheless fear for your safety and want to be able to help. So starting that discussion doesn't mean that you're starting the process of stopping driving. The discussion about driving, just like MS itself, should be progressive. Modifications should be made depending on your abilities at a certain time, and then change over time to meet your needs. Driving adaptations are very common, not only for individuals with MS, but people with other disabilities, and as I mentioned, people who are aging. We're all going to probably have to make some kinds of adaptations and modifications in our driving habits as we get older. So again, starting that dialogue, making the modifications, and using adaptive equipment are all ways to keep yourself on the road longer and not take your license away. Ali, I think you can tell us more about some of the adaptive equipment that's out there that can be useful.
So there's lots of different adaptive equipment. The handy bars are very simple adaptive equipment. We'll talk about some more high-tech ones as well. But this is just to help getting in and out of the car. So any car past 2000 has a little bolt inside the door, and where this guy, if we go to the next slide, you could see could just fit into, and you can use it for leverage as you're getting in and out of the car. And that's a simple thing you can find on a Walmart or Amazon for, I believe, under $20. Other simple ones, if there's decreased visual field or decreased neck rotation, or just blind spot reducing mirrors, and having those in the car, because that is the number one thing where someone makes a lane change and they fail to check their blind spot, or they couldn't physically do it, and so something like this can simply help with that. Now, when we're looking at a little bit more extensive adaptive equipment, these are steering controls. So the individuals I've seen with MS, they were trained on hand controls. And with hand controls, you typically have one hand on the gas brake mechanism and one hand on the wheel. Now, for the wheel to have full control for turns and for it to be smooth and to be able to make quick actions if needed, you're going to need a steering device. And these are some examples. Typically, the top left corner one, the steering knob, is what's used, and that gives the person with good grip being able to use that. Adaptations are possible too, but typically with MS, we're looking at the steering knob on the top left or below it, steering rod. And just depends on a person's preference, and sometimes if their grip is weaker or stronger, if they can supinate or pronate, all those comes into a factor of part of the clinical evaluation to determine what's needed and what would suffice. So when we're looking at those hand controls for braking and accelerating, there's various types. All of them, typically, you push forward on the device to brake. And then there's varying ones for accelerating. There's pulling back. There's bringing it towards your side. That's called the right angle one. There's a twist, like a motorcycle. And there's the push rock, where you kind of rock it back. So again, from my practice, we have the top through, and then I have the individual try them out, see what they prefer, getting on the feel. Sometimes one's easier than the other of what they want and what would fit them in their car. So these are some pictures of how it would look, like I mentioned earlier. The one hand's going to be on the steering, one hand's going to be on the braking. These ones pictured are on the left. Most are on the left. You can get it on the right side, install it that way, but typically it's recommended the dominant hand, which for most people is the right hand, to be on the steering. And in addition, a lot of rent-a-cars, if you're going to be traveling, you need hand controls. from Hertz or Enterprise. They're going to have this, which I don't know if most people know, but you could get that if you give them 24 hours in advance what you need as far as adaptive equipment. But they're going to be on the left side. They don't have any on the right side for the braking and gas. So typically, evaluators, most places are going to have it on the left, and that's how you're going to learn and typically purchase. For some individuals, a left foot accelerator might be needed. I haven't used that too much with my MS clients, but that's where if the foot or right leg is the issue, that's the only one with reaction issues or coordination issues, but the left is intact, which again doesn't happen typically. They could be trained on the left foot accelerator. And then with any of these, training is necessary. So please don't go get this on Amazon or a used website and start driving. These need training. A story I'll share, I saw an individual who had a right leg amputation below knee. And I saw him in the hospital, and I let him know about our program and told him, come see me when you're discharged and you're ready to drive, and this is something we could look at. Well, he had lost his right leg to poor diabetes management, and he decided this is what he was going to get. I don't know how his sensation and coordination was in his left feet because I didn't evaluate him, and it probably weren't good if it was poor diabetes management. Anyway, he came into his physical therapy session one day, and he was parking. He mistook the gas and brake. He floored it on the gas when he thought it was the brake and went through our lobby. And luckily, there was no one in the lobby in that section that he went through or anyone crossed in front of him. But when we're looking at adaptive equipment, training sessions are required to be competent and be safe. This is another type of adaptive equipment. It's called a mobile eye. I believe it was just bought by Intel. So a lot of new cars have it. So it gives you the forward collision warning if you're going too fast, you're not braking enough, or lane departure warning. What's nice about something like this is if you don't have the income to go buy a brand new car, this can go into your older car. I believe it typically runs about $800 for the part and another $800 for installation. So it's not cheap, but in retrospect, looking at it to a new car, it could be something that could help. Now, sometimes with all the adaptive equipment, you need to stop driving, and which is difficult. Even with all the things available, the impairments are too great, and an individual needs to retire from that. And then Cecilia can talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, so, at some point, the adaptive equipment is not enough, and then you face that harder question about whether or not it's time to stop driving. And no one expects this is an easy transition to make, either practically or emotionally. Driving is the most important activity or ability that many fear will go away. And it's practically and emotionally challenging to face these losses or changes in your driving habits. It's not unusual to feel feelings of grief because you are losing things. You may have a sense of losing your independence, may indicate more of a loss of your health, your identity as a person who's able to get around and take care of themselves. That's tied in with our sense of self-worth. Then you may start questioning whether you're a good parent, spouse, friend if you can't drive, because we load driving with so many identity issues. You may ask yourself if you're competent. How will it look to others if I can't drive? So it's not uncommon to have these feelings of grief. And then on top of that, you've got some very real lifestyle changes that you have to contend with. You'll be adjusting daily activities based on how you can get around to them and who you can ask for help. And you will be asking others for help and depending on them. And part of that dependence and that reliance is feeling okay about asking others for help and depending on them for routine tasks. Another big transition, especially for, many people just, that sense of independence is so important and so essential to who we are. So these adjustments will start to happen. To many, losing that ability to drive is also associated with, a sense of personal failure. It's tied in with how you're perceiving your disease and perhaps feeling like you're giving into it if you're backing off on the driving. And it often is maybe one more very real and significant sign or milestone in the decline that's caused by MS and what you're giving up. It can feel emasculating, especially for men, and it can lead to sadness and depression. And we've talked about those statistics about depression and MS, which, by the way, and I meant to mention at the other point that some of the associations with depression may also be associated with drugs that you're taking, but they certainly are also associated with coping with life changes that living with MS can bring on. So no one wants to give up driving. No one wants to give up their independence. But I think it requires a new sense of what independence means to us. And as the National MS Society says, being independent includes recognizing when it's no longer safe to perform certain activities. And some of those activities also includes driving. And it's very important to plan for that day. And I think planning is sort of the key word here and essential. Keeping yourself safe is the main point, and part of keeping yourself safe is looking ahead and trying to plan on how you can do that. So when you get to the point when you feel like you have to or are ready to live without your car, there are certain things that maybe you can set up. So bottom line is it's important to stay active. You don't need a car to stay active. It helps, but there are ways that you can get around it. One of those ways is, again, not being afraid to ask others for assistance. And many people will ask you how they can help, and many of us tend not to take people up on their offers to help. But people do really like to help. They get pleasure and gratification out of being able to help a friend in need. So when they ask you, find ways. Perhaps it's running to the drugstore for you, or doing a little bit of grocery shopping, or picking up kids at school. There are many small things that people will be very happy to pitch in and help out on. Again, you've already set up your public transportation options from before, and now it's time to really understand how to use them and how to access public transportation. You can also make a list of alternatives like reliable cab companies, creating Uber and Lyft accounts and other car service accounts. They're very convenient, and you can get a Lyft or an Uber to pick you up within minutes usually. You can set up carpools with friends and colleagues. Really important also to check in with your church or community groups, social services. They often have volunteer lists. People are happy to drive neighbors or members to anywhere, really, doctor's appointments, grocery runs, whatever you might need. Then, of course, are the institutional aspects of this. You can contact your state office of disability services, the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center for their accessible transportation options as well. And the National MS Society also has lists of transportation programs and providers. So good to check all of these things out. So when you start to change your driving habits, or when you get to the point where you feel like maybe you need to stop driving, it's critical, I think, to understand that as important as driving is to our lives and to our personal lives, life doesn't end without driving, but it certainly will change. You will be creating a new normal, and I think it makes sense to try and define for yourself what that new normal means for you, what your new independence means, what shape that will take, and how you are going to define your new freedom going forward. One of the quotes I really like is by Thich Nhat Hanh, talking about what freedom is and how to achieve it and what it eventually leads to. And I'm just going to read it here because it's here, but I think it's really something that means a lot to me anyway. So letting go gives us freedom, and freedom is the only condition for happiness. And I think you can be happy with or without a car. So I'll leave you with Thich Nhat Hanh. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Cecilia and Ali, for taking time to share your perspectives and for some really great information that hopefully our participants can use now or in the future when that time comes. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening and for participating. We do have about 10 minutes or so for some questions, and we received a lot of them, so we'll try to get to as many as we can. Ali, we received a lot of questions. You brought up some great adaptations and modifications to cars. Can you talk a little bit about what you know about as far as does insurance pay for some of these? Are there financial assistance programs available? Anything about helping with paying for some of these modifications?
Okay. No, insurance does not cover for the evaluations or adaptive equipment. As far as there are resources though. So for get a new car, a lot of the car companies like Nissan, Toyota, Ford, all of them actually have, if you go to a website and you type in their name and then mobility reimbursement or mobility assistance. So if you put in Honda Mobility Assistance in Google, typically they reimburse an individual up to $1,000 for any adaptive equipment installed. Okay. Other sources for funding, because it is expensive, if a person is a vet, I've had individuals use the Semper Fi Fund or Wounded Warriors Fund. I've had individuals use these days with like the GoFundMe as far as raising money for the adaptive equipment, or looking at their communities, not just how Cecilia mentioned for transportation, but looking at the church or other services where maybe they could get funding that way. One last thing I want to bring up that a lot of people actually underutilize is the Department of Rehabilitation in their state. So the Department of Rehab in California, if a person wants to go to school or is seeking to work, they offer a lot of things to help aid that person, and that includes a driving evaluation and equipment. But you can't go into any of those Department of Rehabs and say, I want to just get a car and adaptive equipment. You have to have a reason where you want to work, you have it because of the deficits, or if you want to go to schooling. And that's a really good underutilized place that I would recommend.
Great, thank you. And it definitely sounds like some of the funding opportunities differentiate between state to state. So going to those different state agencies or the National MS Society is a great starting point. Cecilia, this is a great question. I think you can touch a little bit more upon. This person is asking, how do you differentiate between a physical or cognitive issue as opposed to just a mental block, like a lack of self-confidence that's keeping me from driving? I think I can drive, but I am afraid. How do you recognize that, and how do you overcome just fear and lack of self-confidence?
That's a good question. That's a tough question. So the difference between physical and cognitive issue versus a mental block. Well, I think that part of that answer may come with a physical evaluation, and then again bringing your doctor into the discussion and having explaining exactly what you're feeling, what problem you think you might be having. There are cognitive tests certainly that can distinguish whether or not it's just a mental block or whether you're really having some kind of an issue or even an issue that's caused by medication or some kind of physical impact that's making you cognitively disabled for whatever the issue is. So I think, involving your doctor, and I think that's the best thing to do. I think you need to just get a professional opinion in there to help you make that decision.
Can I add to that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so the whole clinical evaluation part of a driving rehab specialist is where we look at the physical aspects, the cognitive, and then the visual. And what I've had before, an individual that was hit by a car and then had PTSD and was always worried about getting in the car. When I tested him in the clinic, he was fine. He was normal. And realized it was more him controlling and seeing a psychologist or a psychiatrist to help with his anxiety that was the limiting factor for him to drive. It wasn't anything that was caused from, for this example, if you're saying from the MS, it was more like the self-confidence that was reduced, and that's something where clinical evaluation can assist with and teasing that out, what's going on.
That's great. It's definitely a complex system of both the cognitive issues and just sort of the mental block. So that's great to get that professional opinion. Ali, I want to go back to you. We received a lot of questions about specific symptoms of MS and strategies or equipment that may be available to compensate for that. I would love for you to add about two in particular, and you can pick which one you'd like to talk about first. But one is heat sensitivity. So they were asking if there's any cooling technology, car seats that are available, and then the second was foot drop, any orthotics or other equipment. So any ideas with those two specific symptoms?
Quickly with the heat. There's nothing that I'm aware of other than just your general common sense of, staying, using your air conditioner, and when it is those hot days or when you are more fatigued, let's say in the afternoon, reducing, and that's where that self-restriction comes into a person's use of modifying their driving. As far as the foot drop, if someone is wearing an AFO, it does make it. Typically, I've seen very few that could do well with an AFO and still be able to coordinate and brake well with that. So that would be something where you should definitely look at getting a driving evaluation by a CDRS and seeing if hand controls are going to be safer for you to drive. And with hand controls, if you're not in a wheelchair, you don't need a ramp. Typically, at least in California, with installation, it's about $1,500. So for that peace of mind, I'd say it's worth getting an evaluation, making sure you're safe to drive. And I would refer to, in the resources at the end of the slides, we did a thing with the MS Society. One of my clients in that, before, she was saying how she loved driving and then was getting scared and was just getting anxious every time she got in the car. And after doing the training and the evaluation and getting a hand control, she enjoyed it again. And she's the one that travels a lot and also uses rentals everywhere she goes. So anytime, like I said, one deficit like foot drop, where it could get stuck between the pedals or reduce the coordination, that's when we want to get evaluated and make sure you're safe.
Great, thank you. Cecilia, you talked a lot about planning, for what's to come, and so you're ready when and if and when it's time to put away those keys or to come up with a different strategy. This writer was saying that with MS, you're always thinking about the worst and getting anxiety about fearing the worst. So can you talk a little bit about the balance between preparing and planning for when difficult times come ahead, and to also not to over worry and to live life in the present?
Yeah, I think that the best way to do that is to live life in the present. So when you are still feeling pretty confident and typically pretty healthy, that's the time to start looking ahead and figuring out what you might need in the future when you're not stressed about it, when you're not feeling the urgency and the immediacy to be making a change or a modification or feeling pressure from other people to make these changes. So I think when you're feeling good, when you still have a lot of your abilities, is the time to look ahead and to make those plans. Make it a lot easier when you get there, and you need to make the changes to have that in place. And I think it feels a lot less difficult and overwhelming because you've done all your groundwork and your homework before you've gotten there.
Great point. And on that note, Ollie, would you recommend getting some of these hand controls or other adaptive equipment before things get worse, or when is the right time to start making some of those adaptations?
The right time is when someone usually gets there. If they have good self-insight and awareness of what's going on, they're noticing that they're being a little bit more apprehensive about driving. They're noticing that they've had some of those red flags that we mentioned with Cecilia. And that's the time to get evaluated and see about adaptive equipment versus waiting until there is an accident or something worse. So that's my recommendation as far as, all those things where if your family's feeling concerned, and there's research shown actually that adult children have a better perspective than spouses, because spouses can be biased in either way. A spouse might want their spouse to continue driving because they don't want to have that burden, or they can't drive themselves, or sometimes the opposite, where they're thinking they shouldn't drive and then not giving them the benefit of the doubt. So taking into account all family members, we'll also think about those adult children who might not be letting you have your grandkids in the car, and why is that?
Right. And with those hand controls, you mentioned that there's definitely some training and preparation that needs to go into it. Is there a special license or learning permit that people need to get to operate those, or how does that formal training?
So you would go through the training with a CDRS, and then you would go to your state DMV and show that you're competent in its use. And then you would have a restriction on your license saying you need, let's say, a hand control and a steer knob to drive. So just like I wear prescription glasses, on the back of my license, I can't drive without either my contacts or glasses on. So instead of saying that, it would say the hand control. And then there, liability-wise, you've shown that not only have you done the training and competency with CDRS, now you've gone with a DMV and gotten their blessing, and they've shown that you're competent. So if anything should happen, if you do get in a random accident, they know that it wasn't because of the MS that caused it, was just a pure accident.
And with those restrictions, or if you voluntarily give up your license and then your MS or your situation improves, is it pretty easy to get your license back or get those restrictions lifted?
I wouldn't say it's easy. I wouldn't say it's difficult. Anytime we're dealing with a Department of Motor Vehicles, it's going to take a little bit of time. But I had individuals that needed adaptive equipment, and then after continuing rehab didn't need it, and then you just have to go back and show, hey, I can drive without this adaptive equipment, and I'll take that restriction off.
Great, thank you. We have time for a couple more. Cecilia, this is certainly, we've covered this, but I think it's a good way to wrap up our discussion here. And this person wrote, I love to drive. It's my source of freedom, my way to avoid loneliness, and my escape from my family's anxiety. How would I fill this void? And how do I ask for help without starting the slippery slope of losing my driver's license?
Ooh, yeah.
Loaded question. We could probably spend another hour and 15 minutes just on this question.
Well, that's the joy of driving. Driving is just an incredible, it's an incredible activity. It can take you places, and it can take your mind different places. And most people love it. I don't know how to fill that specific void, except to find an alternative for filling that place in your mind where you can find some sense of freedom. So perhaps it's in the new connections and relationships that you make because you can't drive, and you're going to have to find the Uber service that you like, that it's able to take you to the place that you want to go, or find the person that you like driving with or carpooling with, who can understand that need to get away or to accomplish what you need to accomplish with a vehicle. Or perhaps it's don't know, dreaming about driving. I'm not sure how you fill that void. I think it's a very personal question, but that's the dilemma, because driving is so much more than just the act of getting into a vehicle and moving. It is so essential to so many things that we do in life and how we identify ourselves, and that's what makes it difficult to give it up.
All right. Certainly starting the discussion is first key. Well, great. Well, Ali, I'll save the last question for you because it's right up your alley. The question is, I would like to know how to find an occupational therapist in my area to help with my driving.
Okay. So at the end of the slides under the resources, a great website is www.aided.net. That's ADED.net. And that shows certified driving rehab specialists throughout the country, actually throughout internationally. So you put in your state, and I would recommend it has certified and non-certified driving rehab specialists. I would recommend the certified ones because we've gone through the extra training and keep up with our education. And but if you don't have one available, then DRS would be fine. So that's a great source to find someone that could do that evaluation for you. And then the other site I failed to mention earlier for funding, the www.nmeda.com. That's the National Mobility Equipment Vendors. So a lot of those people, they sell adapted vans and equipment, and a lot of them have used inventory. So you could look at a vehicle that you're looking at used. And I would recommend typically nothing past 50,000 miles. And if you're going to get something installed in your car, think about it being in there for at least 5 years because of the cost. So those are some things that your OT or CDRS can help with as far as when you're looking at if you need adaptive equipment.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for that great information and those perspectives that I think were valuable to all of us. Thank you again for everyone for joining us. I'd like to tell you quickly about a few more programs and resources that may be of interest to you. Can Do MS. We have all sorts of different in-person and online programs in cities all over the country. We do our webinar series once a month on various topics. You can also submit a question to our Ask the Can Do team. So if we didn't get to your question tonight, definitely go to our website, which is cando-ms.org, and you can submit a question, and we'll try to get it answered by our team of healthcare experts. In addition, the National MS Society has a great library of resources and information on all sorts of different topics, but driving is one area that they have a lot of information and resources on, and we'll email you a PDF with all these links, and you'll be able just to click right on some of these hyperlinks to view some of these videos and brochures, and they have a whole website dedicated to driving issues. As Ali mentioned, there's also a lot of other great resources out there. And again, in your email that you'll receive, you can click right on these links to some great resources on driver rehab and equipment dealers. And then, as I mentioned, Cecilia mentioned, she wrote a great article about the family dynamics and psychological issues of losing your license. And so there's a link to that article that I would definitely recommend that you read. We hope you can join us again for our next webinar, which will be, it's always on the second Tuesday of each month. The next one will be on August 14th. And we'll be talking about progressive MS and some of the research and rehab strategies that are involved with progressive MS. So that should be a really good one. So we hope you can join us. And then lastly, if you did enjoy the content on the program this evening, and you're able to help us out to be able to provide more free programs, there's an opportunity to contribute to Can Do MS, and we hope we can continue bringing you different topics and great resources. So thank you again for joining us this evening. Cecilia and Ali, thank you so much for your time and your contributions. We really appreciate it. And we hope you'll join us again soon for our next webinar. You'll receive a survey after tonight's program. We'd love for you to fill that out to let us know what you enjoyed and what we can still provide you. And again, this program will be archived so you can go back and view it. So again, thank you for joining us, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks, Ali.
Thank you both.
Thank you all. Pleasure.
Bye-bye.